Having done all the preparatory work of examining, studying, analyzing the text that I'm going to preach on, in this case, 1 John 1, 1 to 4, I now turn my attention to the sermon I'm preparing to preach. And my next step is to identify and formulate what I call the heart of the message. Last time I identified what I call the brain of the passage of scripture, which becomes the brain of my sermon. And I defined it in this way: what will be the main thrust of this sermon that will communicate the main point of this text to these people? But I now need to crystallize that still further as I get down to the actual preparation of my sermon. I need to take that brain, the main truth that I want to concentrate on and preach on, and I need to find a way to express it in contemporary terms, in a way that people will grasp. Now, I decided, for a number of reasons that I spelled out last time, that of all the options available to me, and there are several in these 4 verses, I'm going to preach on the fact that the foundation of our experience of fellowship with God is the reliable eyewitness accounts of those who heard, saw, and touched him, and then passed it on to us, that which they'd seen, heard, and touched. But I need to make that sharper, more pointed, more concise. And this process is vital for clarity, both in my own mind, but also in my preparation. You see, just as every text of scripture has one MTH, or main theme, one overriding purpose, so every sermon or message should have one controlling or dominating subject. That's why it needs to be clear and succinct in my own mind and heart, because this becomes the organizing principle of my sermon. Everything I say will flow from, lead up to, and reinforce this truth. The other reason I want to craft the MTH of my sermon, what's technically called a homiletical proposition, is because I want it to be something that will make an impact on the hearts and minds of my hearers. See, I'm well aware of the truth that those who listen to me will forget, or at least not take in, the vast majority of everything I say in a perhaps 40-minute sermon. But if I work on my homiletical proposition, my sermon's MTH, that I'm increasing the chances of at least that sticking in people's minds and memories. And when they recall that, they'll then be able to recall other parts of the content of the sermon as well. So what I'm looking for in the statement of the heart of my sermon is a complete idea framed in a propositional statement and not just a single word. It must clearly connect with the biblical text in order to be faithful to the passage of scripture, but it may express it differently. After all, I'm not preparing a commentary on the text. I'm preparing a sermon drawn from the text. So this heart of my sermon statement must be both grounded in the text, in other words, biblically driven, and also aimed at my hearers, audience orientated. Now, my goal now, which I don't always achieve, it has to be said, is to come up with a statement, a proposition that is as memorable as possible, that uses language and words that are as precise and concrete as I can make them. It could be in the form of a statement or a question. And it should contain a key word that characterizes the main points of my message. So here's what I've come up with. After numerous days of reflection and prayer and playing with words and phrases in my head, here's my sermon MTH, the heart of my sermon. Our fellowship with God is founded on the first-hand testimony of the first disciples who knew Jesus. Now, I may yet improve on that. I've got time to do that if I need to. But let me explain my thinking, because I have crafted this with some thought. I am, as I said, aiming for a statement that is as memorable as possible, and one that uses concrete language and includes a key word that characterizes the main point of the message. Well, first, those who know me well are well aware of my predilection for alliteration, and I make no apology for that. It can, of course, be overdone and forced, but used well, it is a tried and trusted aid to memorizing things. So I have used 4 words: fellowship, founded, firsthand, and first. Second, I've used the word fellowship because that is a key word in these 4 verses, and as we have seen, is part of the purpose for which John is writing, as he tells us in verse 3. And interestingly, looking ahead slightly, it's also a key word in the next section, verses 5 to 10, where it also occurs twice. So I'm also going to use this word as a bridge into the second sermon in my series. So then I've used the word founded, partly because it's alliterative, but mainly because it echoes a theme that runs through this letter, culminating in 5:13, that you may know. John wants us to be sure of something, and to be sure of something, it depends on a solid and reliable foundation. Then I've used that word firsthand, again because it's alliterative, but also because it brings in the elements of heard, seen, touched, looked upon that John uses. It's a foundational element of John's whole argument in this letter against the false teachers. I have first-hand testimony, he says. Then fourthly, I've opted for first disciples rather than apostles, though I did wrestle with this somewhat. I was drawn initially to using the word apostles because it carries that element of authority with it. But of course, the 12 were not the only ones who heard, saw, touched, and looked upon Jesus. And so I went for first disciples because I was still trying to come up with something that was as memorable as possible. And one more thought, just to show that I'm not totally addicted to alliteration. One of my original thoughts was to speak of our fellowship with the Father, which gives another F, of course. But then that would not faithfully reflect the text, which expressly speaks of fellowship with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So I opted for the one word God. Now, here's one more element of my thinking. I may very well structure my whole sermon around these 4 words or phrases: fellowship, founded, firsthand, first disciples. Because if I do that, it will enable me to repeat this sentence or an improved version of it several times during my sermon. And doing that will drive it home as the great truth above all that I want my listeners to take away in their memories and in their hearts. Because I think that is what John wants to convey as his main point. One writer speaks to preachers about what he calls the 3 a.m. test. You know, if your wife nudges you awake at 3 a.m. and asks you, what are you preaching on this morning? You ought to be able to tell her in one sentence, one propositional statement. It should be that clear in your mind. And if it's not that clear in your mind, then you probably better get out of bed, get back to the desk, and get back to work. That's a 3 a.m. test. I want to suggest it also ought to be a 3 p.m. test for your congregation. You should be able to go to a member who's listened to you during the morning service and ask them at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as it were, what was my sermon about this morning? And hopefully they'll come up with a pretty good paraphrase, if not a direct quote, of your propositional statement.